Star Wars fans love debating who was the most powerful Sith Lord in history. This is difficult to gauge, but Vitiate, the immortal Sith Emperor, is definitely in the conversation. He's certainly the most enduring Sith Lord, having wreaked havoc across 1300 years. In this video, I'm going to take you through the entire story of Vitiate, from his origins as Tenebrae, a Sith prodigy on Madrias, to his rule over the Eternal Empire on Zakuul. I want to begin this video by explaining clearly who Vitiate was, because he was a being of multiple identities, names, and even bodies. This Sith Lord managed to transfer the essence of his being between physical hosts, enabling him to prolong his life into a second millennium. However, it can be a bit tricky to keep track of his dark deeds over such a long period. So let's do a brief overview before taking a deep dive into everything we know about Vitiate and his horrific crimes against the universe. This may have been the most terrifying era to be alive in the Star Wars galaxy, and we know that there's plenty of competition. Vitiate had several names throughout his lifetime, but there were three dominant ones for each of the most defining periods of his existence. The first was his original name as Tenebrae, as a youngster on the Sith world of Madrias. This was more than 5000 BBY when Madrias was a prosperous agricultural planet under the control of the Sith Empire. According to the novel Old Republic Revan, Tenebrae was the illegitimate son of the planet's ruler, Lord Drameth, and a farm woman on the planet's northern continent. Tenebrae was a member of the original Sith species, a red-skinned race of beings that originated from Korriban. The Old Republic Revan explains that Tenebrae's ruthless deeds attracted the attention of Sith Emperor Marka Ragnos, the ruler of the Sith Council. Tenebrae's body of work impressed the Dark Lord of the Sith, and so he gave him Madrias to rule himself, as well as the new name of Vitiate. It's worth noting that although many people refer to him as Darth Vitiate, this was never a title that he used himself. He also renamed Madrias as Nathema and ruled the planet for a century. This was when Vitiate demonstrated his cunningness and his capacity to play the long game. He allowed the other Sith Lords to fight and weaken themselves after Ragnos died. Then, after the defeat of Naga Sadow, a name you'll know if you played Knights of the Old Republic, in the Great Hyperspace War, Vitiate made his move. He lured the remaining Sith Lords to Nathema, where he performed one of the most insane rituals in Star Wars history, draining their life essence as well as that of every living being on the planet. Vitiate's next step was to leave the husk of Nathema behind, where he brought Sith survivors of the Great Hyperspace War to the lost world of Dromund Kaas. He established a new empire and eventually uncovered the hidden world of Zakuul and its eternal fleet, giving him access to advanced technology and almost unstoppable power. Vitiate wasn't totally down with Sith ideology, so he divided his consciousness and poured it into a Zakuulan warlord called Valkorion. Emperor Valkorion pursued absolute immortality and domination of the galaxy. Yes, more than 5,000 years later, Darth Sidious would be trying to achieve the same thing. There's no doubt that Vitiate was a high achiever in the darkest sense of the meaning and a being of almost irrepressible power. Now that I've given you this basic context, let's start our deep dive. Let's go back to the very beginning now and look at the state of the galaxy around the time Tenebrae was born on Madrias. This was back in the early days of the Old Republic when the Sith species still thrived. The Tales of the Jedi companion book explains how the Sith originated on Korriban. These beings had a natural affinity with the Force and existed for thousands of years before Dark Jedi exiles landed on the planet. The Dark Jedi dominated the native Sith and enslaved them, although they also procreated together, diluting the purity of the species. The Knights of the Old Republic campaign guide reveals how these self-declared Sith Lords interbred with their subjects, including the Massassi subspecies, over 2 millennia. Gradually, they expanded outward from Korriban and conquered other systems to establish a powerful Sith Empire, including Dromund Kaas, Khoriz, Malachor V, and of course, Madrias. According to Jedi vs. Sith, the essential guide to the Force, the Sith Empire had about 120 planets at its peak in the Outer Rim. Their culture and ideology continuously evolved throughout this period as they sought to find new ways to manipulate the dark side of the Force. They had an especially disturbing reverence for the living dead, as we'll come to talk about later in this video, and maintained a raw, fanatical hatred for the Jedi Order. However, it's also worth noting that they existed entirely apart from the Republic. Instead, Sith Lords fought amongst each other in petty local squabbles as they sought to strengthen their own little fiefdoms of feudal warlords. Everything changed when Mark Aragnos became the Dark Lord of the Sith and supreme ruler of the Sith Council, crushing dissent and triggering the golden age of the Sith. Well, the General has been making additions to his collection for several years now, and if you're anything like me, you've probably imagined what it could be like to own a saber yourself. So that's why I started my own store called Stickman Sabers, with a singular goal in mind. Make sabers that look amazing, being inspired by iconic designs, but specifically built to actually duel with. No worrying about babying them, just pick them up and go ham. They're equipped with state-of-the-art pixel technology, giving off an incredibly bright light that will light up the darkest rooms out there. And obviously have that iconic hum, just feels right the moment you switch it on. And for a limited time, if you pick a collector's saber up, you'll also get 2 combat sabers for free. So, if you ever thought about starting your own collection, this is a pretty good place to start. Links in the description, and now, let's get back to the video. Tenebrae was born in 5113 BBY. During this period on Madrius, after his father, Lord Drameth, the planet's ruler, had an affair with a poor farm woman. Drameth was a Red Sith, or a pureblood, which the Lost Tribe of the Sith ebook series explains was also the ruling class. These were effectively the remnants of the original Sith species, characterized by an extremely predatory appearance with sharp features and vibrant red skin. The Sith had a caste system, including the Zuguruk, or engineers who created their technology, the Massassi warriors, the Kisai priests, and finally, their slaves. Even though Tenebrae's mother was a mere farmer, the future Emperor was still considered a member of the Sith aristocracy. The Old Republic, Revan, reveals that Sith society was patrilineal, and that Force-sensitive bloodlines were valued more than occupation. However, it ultimately didn't really matter in Tenebrae's case, because if there were any doubts, he very quickly put them to rest. Any horror movie fan will tell you that children can be terrifying. Tenebrae took this to a whole new level. First, let's talk about his physical appearance. He had the body of a pureblood Sith, but his eyes were as black as the voids of space. Even more disconcerting, as an infant, he never displayed any emotion. But what he did show was Force nascency, which confused his stepfather, who accused Tenebrae's mother of an affair. She admitted that the child was Lord Droman's, and the stepfather responded furiously. He violently attacked her, which was a fatal mistake. The Old Republic Revan explains that this anger fueled Tenebrae's darkness, and he used the Force to snap his stepfather's neck. You might think that this was because he was defending his mother, but you'd be wrong. The 6-year-old, yes, you heard that right, proceeded to torture her for several months before killing her because she betrayed her family. It obviously didn't faze him that he was the result of this supposed betrayal, and that she probably couldn't have said no to the planet's ruler anyway. Tenebrae's path to darkness quickly evolved into a highway to hell. Over the next 4 years, the youngster started subjugating the surrounding villages and gathering fanatical followers. The burgeoning Dark Lord also butchered thousands during his rise in mass executions. The Revan novel tells us that he fed off their suffering as his followers tortured them for days. It's crucial to remember that this was perfectly kosher on a Sith world where death and power were closely intertwined. The Old Republic Encyclopedia reveals that all of this was happening on the northern continent of Madrius, which was supposedly less developed and significant than other regions of the world. That's also why Lord Drameth didn't really pay attention to what was going on. Also, Drameth had completely forgotten about the existence of Tenebrae's mother and his affair with her. But eventually, the rumors of Tenebrae's shenanigans became too extraordinary to ignore, and Drameth decided it was time to investigate. According to Sith culture, Drameth would either kill him or make Tenebrae one of his personal subjects. Unfortunately for him, things didn't work out the way he expected. Drameth confronted the 10-year-old who mentally subdued him, with most of his subjects believing that he was dead. However, the reality was that Tenebrae overpowered him and left him weeping in terror. The 10-year-old trapped his biological father's spirit in a Sith holocron and enshrined it in a vault in the sanitarium. This structure would eventually become the only habitable building on the entire planet. Players of the Knights of the Old Republic expansion, Knights of the Eternal Throne, meet Drameth and have the option to free or release him. The narrative version is that the Outlander, whom we'll discuss more later, freed him, allowing his spirit to pass on to the next world. Ironically, over his millennium in captivity, Drameth became Tenebrae's closest equivalent to a confidant. And I can guarantee that he would have a lot to talk about. With Drameth out of the picture, Tenebrae became the indefatigable ruler of Madrius. It didn't happen overnight, but over the next 3 years, Tenebrae asserted his dominance over the planet. Other Sith Lords from off-world attempted to take advantage of the supposed power vacuum, but they fell before him. One Sith who didn't hang around was Drameth's son and Tenebrae's half-brother, Drameth II. The Essential Reader's Companion explains that Drameth II saw the writing on the wall and fled the planet. This was a wise move, because Tenebrae wanted to eliminate him, identifying him as a clear threat to his rule. Ultimately, Drameth II died on the icy planet of Rekiad, of unknown causes, and his servants entombed him. Finally, when he was 13, Tenebrae presented himself to the Dark Lord of the Sith, Marka Ragnos. The Book of the Sith confirms this meaning, but doesn't state where it took place. Although it was likely on Korriban, the Sith homeworld, this was make or break for the young man because Ragnos was no joke. As his title suggests, he was the most powerful Sith Lord of his day. Interestingly, he was a half-breed Sith Lord, proving that biology didn't define one's ability to use the Force. According to Star Wars Behind the Magic, Ragnos defeated his main rival for the title of Dark Lord of the Sith, Seamus, in a duel. Seamus was a pure blood, with many Sith regarding him as the noblest and wisest of the age. However, Ragnos decapitated him in a ferocious duel and claimed his indisputable status as ruler of the Sith. Tales of the Jedi explains that the act of losing his head wasn't enough to kill Seamus, who clung to life by having a servant encase it in a crystal sphere. He didn't hold it against Ragnos either, because he became one of the Dark Lord's most trusted counselors. The Dark Side Sourcebook explains how Ragnos changed the condition of Sith in the galaxy. He had a greater vision than petty infighting and sought to unite his fellow Dark Side users in one empire. Ragnos brutally defeated anybody who defied his plans, but also solidified a golden age for the Sith Empire over the next century. He was extraordinarily inventive, as he created dark gauntlets that increased his skills with a Sith sword or lightsaber, as we see in Knights of the Old Republic. Crucially, he also designed a scepter that could siphon and store dark side power. It's no wonder that Tenebrae identified Ragnos as the perfect teacher and desired to be his apprentice. This didn't interest the Dark Lord, but he didn't dismiss the teenager out of hand. Tenebrae's dark side portfolio obviously impressed him because he recognized him as the ruler of Madrias and gave him the new name of Lord Vitiate. Moving forward, I'm going to refer to Tenebrae as Vitiate just to keep things simple. The Old Republic Revan reveals that Vitiate went back to his home planet and renamed it Nathema. He also built a palace on the site of his family home, where he ruled for a full century. Now we're moving toward one of the darkest and most disturbing chapters of this tale. I already briefly outlined how Vitiate consolidated his power on Nathema, biding his time before making his next move. This patience was crucial to his success because it was before he was at his full power. The death of Marka Ragnos in 5000 BBY left a massive power vacuum in the Sith Empire, with Naga Sadow and Ludo Kresh leading the two dominant factions against each other. Ragnos' ghost appeared to the two competing Sith Lords at his funeral ceremony as they were about to duel. It revealed that the one deserving of the title of Dark Lord would emerge victorious. At this point, I want to do a brief sidebar on the Great Hyperspace War because it will contextualize the state of the galaxy when Vitiate finally stepped out of the shadows. Tales of the Jedi explains the sudden arrival of Gav and Jory Daragon, a pair of Republic fugitives who made a blind hyperspace jump and found themselves in Sith space. These unexpected visitors from the Republic stunned the Sith, who immediately imprisoned them. Their arrival immediately fueled both Sadow and Fresh's campaigns. Kresh believed that the appearance of the Daragon signaled the Republic's preparations for an imminent attack. He framed it as an advanced scouting mission and demanded that the Sith increase their defenses. On the other hand, Sadow saw it as an opportunity to expand the Sith Empire, although he also framed the Republic as an aggressor. However, in stark contrast to Kresh, he wanted the Sith to attack first. Sadow even went as far as breaking the Daragons out of prison and instigating a false flag operation against the Sith Empire. Obviously, this enraged Kresh when he discovered the truth. Sadow even killed his former master Seamus with a Republic blaster in the fake attack, leaving it as dubious evidence. I could go deeper into this, but that's another video. For now, it's enough to say that Sadow outwitted Kresh at the Battle of Car Delva and believed his nemesis dead. He assembled a massive fleet and launched a massive campaign against the Republic after tricking the Daragons into revealing their location. He also left the Sith Empire completely unprotected, which worked out as well as you might expect. Tales of the Jedi also showed his strategy of using a Force meditation sphere to project the image of a far larger Force than was actually there. Sadao enjoyed massive early success and even almost took Coruscant as part of a massive assault on the core. However, his plans fell apart because of Gav Daragon's love for his sister. The Dark Lord of the Sith believed he had bent Daragon to his will and secured the former Jedi trainee as his acolyte. But everything changed when Gav encountered his sister Jory in the inflamed streets of his native city of Sinagar. He didn't provide Sadao with the reinforcements he needed to secure Coruscant's conquest, and the Republic and the Jedi turned the tide against the invading Sith, forcing Sadao into a retreat. He believed that this was just temporary, and that he'd be able to regroup above Korriban before re-attempting an invasion. But little did he expect Ludo Krish to be waiting for him. And another furious battle began. This time, Sadao finally destroyed Krish and his flagship, but at a great cost. Meanwhile, a Republic fleet had successfully pursued and further punished his forces, forcing Sadao to flee. His audacious gamble had almost succeeded, but ultimately, he overreached, and it cost him everything. He spent his remaining days in exile on Yavin 4, remaining an insidious and powerful influence on later Sith, including Freedon Nad and Exar Kun. Sadao's greed left the Sith Empire in tatters, but it also provided a massive opportunity for Vitiate, who decided that it was time to stake his claim. He stroked fear across the Empire by broadcasting speeches about how the Jedi Order planned to destroy the Sith Empire and eradicate its people. In the Old Republic, Revan explains how he creates an atmosphere of terror and panic while simultaneously providing the only voice of strength and solace. However, the Republic didn't help matters when they actually did attack the Sith Empire, with Supreme Chancellor Pultimo ordering their forces to destroy any Sith artifacts they encountered. Before we feel too sorry for them, it's important to remember that all of these relics and tools were either created by dark side practitioners for or from intense suffering. Nevertheless, the invasion gave Vitiate momentum, and was the catalyst for him to invite the remaining Sith Lords to Nathema. He even traveled to Korriban and promised the Sith that he would lead them through a great ritual that would give them the power to save the Sith Empire. Cue the foreboding music. At this point, most of the Sith didn't even consider that Vitiate had grand ambitions to rule the galaxy. He projected himself as a scholar of dark and arcane mysteries, and isolated his world from infighting and galactic conflicts. This was actually true up to a point, because he desperately wanted to locate the lost Sith world of Dromund Kaas. The Old Republic Revan explains that he believed it to be the true homeworld of the Sith, although this remains unconfirmed. While this storyline is entirely from legends, it's worth noting that Dromund Kaas exists in canon too. The canon reference book, The Rise and Fall of the Galactic Empire, notes that Darth Sidious visited the world in search of Sith artifacts. Anyway, Vitiate's researchers finally found a hyperspace route to Dromund Kaas that crucially remained a secret from the Jedi. The Sith Lords heeded the call and traveled in their droves to Nathema. They agreed to participate in Vitiate's ritual, believing that it would lead the Sith to a new dawn. However, he betrayed them by trapping their minds in the ritual and draining their entire life force. According to the Old Republic Encyclopedia, the ritual took 10 days for Vitiate to complete. He absorbed almost the entire living essence of the planet with 2 exceptions. As I mentioned earlier, he had already constructed the sanitarium where he kept his ancient Sith relics and artifacts, including that holocron with his father's tortured spirit. We know from the Old Republic video game that Nathema Zealots guarded the sanitarium and were the only sentient survivors of the Void. They endured because of an intense regime of meditation and daily rituals that ultimately left them dependent on the Void to exist. If they left the planet, they would quickly fall into a catatonic state. Vitiate used them as an elite guard to guard his secrets. Outside of the sanitarium, the only living beings were the Vorclaw. These were a species of insects that Vitiate kept as an extra layer of protection. However, players of the Old Republic will remember that the ritual forced them into cannibalism because there was literally nothing else alive for them to eat. Not even droids survived the cataclysm. The ritual had the effect of granting Vitiate immortality and immense, unimaginable power. From this moment, the Sith no longer named him Vitiate, but simply the Emperor. Vitiate's first move as Emperor was to tell everyone left in the Sith Empire that the Jedi destroyed Nameth. Then he persuaded them to follow him in a massive exodus from Korriban and the other key Sith planets to the rediscovered world of Dromund Kaas. Fate of the Jedi Ascension partly references this lore and reveals that Vitiate forced his exiles to follow him in a series of blind hyperspace jumps to further increase their dependence on him. Anyone who knows anything about hyperspace travel knows how incredibly dangerous this is. The chance of smashing into space debris or a celestial body is very high, and an unwitting pilot could find themselves lost forever in a hostile part of the galaxy. It took over 20 years for them to finally reach Dromund Kaas, where they settled in the planet's savage jungles and created a makeshift settlement that over the centuries evolved into Kaas City, the planet's skyscraper-filled capital. Again, this will be familiar to players of the Old Republic because it's an explorable in-game location. The question most people are probably asking now is why go all the way to Dromund Kaas instead of simply establishing himself as Sith Emperor on Korriban? The main reason was that the journey allowed Vitiate to separate himself from the conventional doctrine of the Sith, something that we'll later see that he didn't always agree with. Also, it enabled him to develop a cult of personality on their long journey to the Lost Planet, which became a Promised Land. The final advantage was that the Republic and the Jedi were unaware of its existence, so the Sith could rebuild and consolidate power after Naga Sadow's catastrophic defeat. It also helped that Dromund Kaas was a dark side hub with ancient structures, including the Dark Temple that contained the tombs of ancient Sith Lords. The Old Republic Codex reveals that Vitiate expanded the structure and transformed it into a horrific nexus of dark side energy through horrifying rituals. This had the dramatic effect of transforming Dromund Kaas's atmosphere as the planet now faced endless rains and lightning. Some of the rituals also resulted in the creation of Sith spawn, including one that became known as Akare, the Ghost of Darkness. Vitiate also established a new Dark Council of 12 Sith Lords who took over the daily administrative functions and rule of his new empire. Separate from this was an extremely secretive order of 12 pureblood Sith who became Vitiate's hand. They held the titles of Servant 1 to 12, similar to Emperor Palpatine's Inquisitors. However, their role was far more important to Vitiate because he drew on their strength to sustain his vast powers. In return, they shared his staggering longevity. Only a couple of members of the Dark Council knew of their existence because Vitiate feared they would be turned against him. Vitiate spent the next 1,000 years building up power and suppressing dissent. He ordered the construction of a space station above Dromund Kaas, where he often retreated to meditate and secretly experiment with the dark side of the Force. Another of his creations was the Ravager, a horrifying device that consumed the minds of its victims and forced them to reveal their deepest secrets as they died. During the early period of his reign, 6 Sith secretly devised a new method of battle meditation that induced extreme fear in enemies. They impressed Vitiate, who bestowed each of them with the title of Dread Master, and they became some of his closest allies. Now, you might assume that immortality and insane power would be enough to make anybody happy, but you would be wrong. Vitiate still had grand aspirations of crushing the Republic and the Jedi before conquering the entire galaxy. However, he was going to do it at his own pace. The Great Sith War took place around 3996 BBY after the Jedi Exar Kun's obsession with the dark side brought him to Yavin 4, where he uncovered ancient Sith secrets. Friedan Nad's spirit corrupted him, and he ignited the Great Sith War against the Republic. It may seem insane that I'm doing a video on one of the most powerful Sith Lords of all time and barely going to talk about this conflict, but the reality is that Vitiate didn't directly impact it in any way, although it's likely he observed it from afar. Instead, he secretly built up his forces and his power in his hidden empire. However, the Great Sith War had the effect of killing hundreds of Jedi and straining the Republic, so it suited him to let Kun do his dirty work for him before his inevitable defeat. Finally, around 3978, Vitiate made his first real move to test the Republic as he ignited a proxy conflict that lasted almost 2 decades. Most people will probably think that Vitiate wanted to defeat the Jedi and the Republic because he was a Sith, and that's what Sith do. But he was far more subtle and devious than this. I want to reiterate that he was playing the long game in the greatest sense of the term. He retreated for lengthy periods, sometimes even years, into deep studies and meditation. Eventually, he learnt that he could expand the ritual that he performed on Nathema on a scale that would impact the entire galaxy. Yes, the same ritual that drained life from the planet, leaving it a barren wasteland. It's fair to ask why he'd want to devastate the galaxy because it would leave him entirely alone. He actually acknowledges this in the Old Republic game, but points out that there are other galaxies that he could conquer and repeat the process if he so chose. He would be invincible, inevitable and endless, free to pursue whatever interest captured his fancy. After several decades, some of his dark counselors learnt of his plan, including Darth Nerys, who was the longest surviving member before Revan defeated her. Vitiate's grand ambitions were on such a terrible scale that it repulsed them, and they began secretly plotting against him. Meanwhile, far, far away, immediately after the Great Sith War, the Republic and the Jedi Order went through several decades of peace and reconstruction known as the Restoration Period. The Knights of the Old Republic campaign guide describes this as an era where the Republic rebuilt its military strength and hyperspace travelers continued exploring the galaxy. They believed the Sith were no longer a meaningful threat, a mistake that has been made time and again. The Republic granted special rights to various galactic corporations to develop its infrastructure in return for safe hyperspace access. Vitiate decided that it was time to test the Republic's defenses and resolve. He sent an emissary to Mandalore the Ultimate, the leader of the Mandalorian warriors. Mandalore the Ultimate was one of the last remaining members of the Tong species. Star Wars Insider 86 explains that these fearsome simian people originally hailed from Coruscant and were the original Mandalorians. Star Wars Insider 80 confirms that they stood about 2 meters tall and weighed around 95 kilograms or about 210 pounds, so they were physically impressive and could endure great hardship. It's crucial to note that before the reign of Mandalore the Ultimate, the Mandalorians were a nomadic culture. The Essential Guide to Warfare explains that they waged war in honor of their gods because they believed it was a divine act. Unfortunately, the Mandalorians pledged allegiance to Zakuul and his apprentice, Ulic Qel-Droma, during the Great Sith War. This was a massive turning point because the Tong species suffered devastating losses during the conflict despite early successes. Mandalore the Ultimate rose to power after the war and began to accept increasing numbers of non-Tong as Mandalorians, most notably humans and Jaquelians. The Emperor seduced Mandalore the Ultimate with visions of power, and through his emissary, convinced him to expand Mandalorian space before fighting the Republic directly. This was also notable because the Mandalorians became imperialist as they chose to occupy planets instead of simply moving on, as they had previously done throughout their history. Mandalore the Ultimate's forces became known as the Neo-Crusaders, and they carved out a massive chunk of territory in the Outer Rim that was even bigger than Hutt space. The Knights of the Old Republic 15 explains that the Neo-Crusaders were ruthless as they decimated planets, including Cathar, and even used nuclear weapons to render them uninhabitable. I'm not going to go too deep into the conflict itself, however, for the sake of this video, it's essential to look at the Jedi reaction because their division had profound and devastating effects on galactic history. Initially, they followed a policy of non-interventionism for a very good reason. The Jedi correctly believed that there was something worse behind the war because the Mandalorians were unusually organized, and a dark presence loomed behind. They wanted to avoid repeating the same mistakes of the costly Great Sith War with Zakuul, where many Jedi died and others fell to the dark side. However, this was a deeply divisive time for the Jedi. Before the Mandalorian Wars, there was a horrifying Padawan massacre, an event where 5 Jedi killed their Padawans during a false knighting ceremony on Taris. They were members of a secret society called the Jedi Covenant that dedicated itself to preventing the return of the Sith. These Jedi had a shared vision that ultimately convinced them that one of their apprentices would kill them and bring about the return of their enemy. Unsurprisingly, this massively destabilized the Jedi Order. There was more chaos during the Mandalorian Wars themselves. One member of the Jedi Council, Master Dorjander Case, married a Mandalorian woman and joined the enemy. He formed the Mandalorian Knights, who hoped to change the Mandalorians from within. But most significantly for this discussion, a young Jedi Knight named Revan and his friend Malak advocated for intervening against the Mandalorians and preventing their domination of the galaxy. The Old Republic Revan tells us how this Jedi and his followers, the Revankists, turned the tide against the Mandalorians. Finally, Revan defeated Mandalore the Ultimate at Malachor V and brought one of the galaxy's bloodiest conflicts to an end. But not before Mandalore the Ultimate realized that the hidden Sith Emperor had tricked him, dooming his species to extinction. He even admitted this to Revan before he died. I've obviously glossed over so much here, but I want to bring the narrative back to Vitiate because that's who we're focusing on. At this point, we should remember that Malachor V was part of the ancient Sith Empire and that Revan and Malak had already encountered Sith ruins on Korriban. This drew the attention of Vitiate. who used his insidious dark powers to subtly manipulate them from the other side of the galaxy, and they became aware of his existence. First, they went to the icy world of Rekiad, where, if you'll remember, Vitiate's half-brother Dremeth II died in exile. They discovered a datachron in his tomb that gave them the location of Nathema. Next, they went to Vitiate's barren homeworld, where they saw the evidence of the Emperor's power with their own eyes. They uncovered the existence of Dromund Kaas and secretly traveled there, leaving their Republic fleet behind. Little did they know that Vitiate was playing them the entire time. They still thought that they were going to confront him, but Vitiate planned to seduce them to the dark side. After finally reaching Dromund Kaas, they spent months infiltrating the Emperor's citadel with the help of a member of the Imperial Guard, who was actually a double agent. Finally, we know from the Old Republic Revan that they entered Vitiate's throne room with the intention of defeating him, but he used the Force to overwhelm their minds and turn them to the dark side, naming them Darth Revan and Darth Malak. The next part of this complex but fascinating story will be familiar to players of Knights of the Old Republic. Vitiate tasked Revan and his apprentice Darth Malak to find the Starforge, an ancient Rakatan space station with immense power. In short, the Starforge drew energy and matter from nearby stars. When a powerful Force user operated it, they could produce a seemingly endless supply of droids, starships, and vehicles. It was the ultimate military factory and a tool of shattering dark-side power that actually destroyed the Rakatan Empire and severed their ability to use the Force. However, this didn't bother Vitiate, who believed he could handle it. So after pulling everything they knew about the Republic from their minds, he sent them on a quest to locate it. What he didn't count on was Revan and Malak being strong enough to cast off his control. Revan's immediate response was to create his own Sith Empire to conquer the Republic with the intention of using their combined forces to defeat Vitiate. He didn't believe that the Republic had the strength to beat the hidden Sith Emperor on his own. The Knights of the Old Republic game doesn't confirm why Revan and Malak initially turned to the dark side, but the Old Republic MMO and the Revan novel fill in these blanks for us. Revan's actions ignited the Jedi Civil War before Malak betrayed him and seized control of the Empire. The Jedi captured Revan and wiped his mind before he returned to the light and went on an epic quest to destroy his old empire, the Starforge, and his apprentice, Darth Malak. This is all the basis of the Knights of the Old Republic game, so I won't spend too long on it. Perhaps the most interesting question is, why didn't Vitiate seize the Starforge from Malak? The short answer is that he didn't believe that victory was inevitable at this stage, nor had he any desire to work with Malak because the young Sith Lord was unstable like Exar Kun, whereas Vitiate was cold and calculated. I can only speculate, but I think it's likely he wanted Malak to unleash as much chaos on the Republic as possible before sweeping in and stealing all the glory. Vitiate also had distractions on his own doorstep that he had to deal with. He correctly believed that there was a conspiracy against him, so a desperate Daenerys decided it was time to save her own skin. She arranged several assassination attempts against herself to make herself look infallible and framed the old human Darth Zedrix. Vitiate disrupted her cunning plan by assigning another Sith to help her identify the perpetrators. This was Lord Scourge, a pureblood Sith and one of the best characters from the Old Republic MMO. After convincing Scourge to murder the unfortunate Zedrix, Daenerys revealed the secret conspiracy to take down the Emperor in the hope that he would join the Dark Council's cause. Meanwhile, around 3954 BBY, Revan re-entered the picture. Haunted by his faded memories of Dromund Kaas, he retraced his steps and returned to Nathema with the intention of pursuing Vitiate across the galaxy. However, Darth Daenerys had brought Lord Scourge to the Emperor's homeworld to reinforce the threat he presented to the galaxy. They arrived at the same time with the Sith shooting Revan's ship, the Ebonhawk, down and capturing the rehabilitated Jedi Master. Daenerys held Revan captive for 4 years, with Lord Scourge torturing him throughout this time. Finally, Revan's former lieutenant, Mitra Surik, the Jedi exile, located him and secured his freedom, for a short while at least. Ironically, Lord Scourge had come to trust the Jedi Master and would join forces with him in the fight against Vitiate. In the Revan novel, we read how Lord Scourge enacted Phase 1 of their master plan to defeat the Emperor. First, the Sith traitor revealed how members of the Dark Council were plotting against Vitiate. The idea was that this would lure Vitiate into a false sense of security and that he would trust Lord Scourge more. However, he reacted by purging the entire Dark Council, even though only 2 of the 12 members were actively conspiring against him. This chaos allowed Lord Scourge to free Revan and Surik, and together with the droid T2M4, they entered the Citadel to confront the Emperor. This was a battle of terrifying power between two of the most powerful Force users in the galaxy. Vitiate almost met his match in Revan, with the Jedi opening himself up to the dark and light sides of the Force in equal measure as he unleashed the Force in its purest form. Vitiate failed in his attempts to mentally dominate the Jedi like he had when they first met. However, everything changed in a moment after he told Lord Scourge of his disappointment in him. Suddenly, the rogue Sith was overcome by visions, and he realized that it was the destiny of another to defeat the Emperor. Scourge committed his fourth major betrayal and stabbed Cyric in the back, distracting Revan long enough for Vitiate to overwhelm him with Force lightning. The Emperor then ordered Scourge to strike Revan down in a test of his loyalty, but intervened before the final blow. The devious Scourge then explained that, of course, he deceived the Jedi and it was all part of his plan to save the Emperor. Vitiate bought this hook, line, and sinker, and promoted Scourge to the newly created position of Emperor's Wrath, granting him immortality. Meanwhile, Vitiate imprisoned Revan in the heart of the Maelstrom Nebula, an area of the galaxy that makes the Maw look like a garden path. He used his dark side powers to prolong Revan's life indefinitely, essentially using him as an energy source to feed his strength and knowledge. What he didn't realize was that Cyric's spirit had outlived her body and would remain loyally by Revan's side. The Old Republic game reveals how Revan was even able to resist Vitiate's domination and counter-influence him because Cyric shared her pure strength with him. It even convinced the Emperor to hold off on invading the rest of the galaxy for another 300 years. But war was inevitable. Before Vitiate was ready to invade the Republic and the rest of the galaxy, he wanted to ensure that he was in the strongest possible position. He studied the deepest arcane mysteries of the dark side and uncovered the technique of essence transfer. In the novel Darth Bane, Dynasty of Evil, we read the words of the Sith Lord Darth Andedu. He says, "Essence transfer is the secret of eternal life. The physical body will always weaken and fail, yet it is nothing but a shell or vessel. When it is time, it is possible to transfer your consciousness, your spirit, into a new vessel. Basically, it's a form of reincarnation that allowed Sith Lords to cheat death again, and again." Just as a side note, this is pretty much what Darth Sidious does in the sequel trilogy. The ritual was insanely risky. If the invading consciousness was strong enough, it could expel the mind of the host body. However, the Dark Empire sourcebook says that it was nearly impossible to cast out a spirit already residing in a body. The other issue was that there was no going back, because the previous body would disintegrate. If the essence transfer failed, it would leave the disembodied spirit with nowhere else to go and consign it to chaos, which is basically Star Wars hell. Another issue that we know from Darth Sidious's experience in the Dark Empire comic book series is that dark side power can cause the host bodies to deteriorate at a faster rate than usual. However, it appears that Vitiate had much more success than Sidious in this respect. One theory behind this is that Vitiate claimed the bodies of powerful Force users, while Sidious used empty clone shells. Over the next 300 years, he used many host bodies to preserve his consciousness and express his will. They varied from a young female human to an aged Sith pureblood, but somewhat disturbingly, they all had the same emotionless male voice. After mastering essence transfer, Vitiate had two more major items on his agenda before he finally moved against the Republic. First, he wanted to ensure his forces were as powerful as possible, so he decided that he had transcended the limitations of Sith teachings. The Old Republic Codex reveals that he uncovered rumors of an ancient fleet of droid-controlled warships that had almost destroyed wild space. Vitiate patiently followed the rumors until they took him to the backwater world of Zakuul. This planet had an almost unique connection to the Force because it was balanced on both light and dark sides. Its primitive settler human population lived in tribes that were almost completely isolated from the rest of the galaxy. Zakuul was irrelevant until the Eternal Fleet began its systematic mission of eradicating life from wild space. They had catastrophic success until a mysterious ship called the Gravestone, a powerful frigate with an omni-cannon, defeated them at Zakuul, before disappearing after the battle with the fleet. Vitiate traveled to Zakuul and decided to make it the capital of his new Eternal Empire. He also overwhelmed the mind of one of the tribal champions named Valkorion in another defining moment in his legacy. It's important to be clear that he was still separately ruling the Sith Empire as a separate entity in another body. Also, he secretly funneled funds from Dromund Kaas to build his new capital on Zakuul. Vitiate completely suppressed Valkorion's mind, and he used his body and identity to rule the planet for centuries. Moving forward, I'm going to use his name to refer to him. Meanwhile, he ruthlessly pursued the rapid industrial and technological development of the planet to make it fit for his empire. First, they created a city in the swamps that wasn't grand enough for Valkorion's needs, and it became known as the Old World. Later, they created a new metropolis that rose into the sky called the Spire. The former Sith Emperor created a new order of Force users known as the Knights of Zakuul from the planet's tribes, who were fanatical in their loyalty to him. Crucially, he used a special sect of the Knights known as the Scions of Zakuul to locate the Eternal Fleet. The final step in his plan was to build the Eternal Throne. This special seat was located in the Starscraper, Zakuul's tallest building, and gave Valkorion control over the sentient Gemini droids that controlled the ships. It took the Emperor and his greatest minds centuries to complete the construction of this essential device. Finally, they used it to bring the Eternal Fleet back into operation and under Valkorion's control, although the gravestone remained lost. Valkorion created a developed society that was the equal of any core world. The Old Republic Codex reveals that every Zakuulan in the Spire received a monthly stipend, as well as all their basic needs such as food, shelter, and clothing. Droids undertook all menial duties so that the citizens could focus on developing sciences, philosophy, and the arts. It would have been a utopia if it weren't for the fact that their Emperor was scheming to drain the entire galaxy of life. Meanwhile, the planet's first city, the Old World, became a lawless zone where crime was rife. Zakuulans often traveled to the Old World to engage in acts of debauchery and fulfill their basest desires before returning to the Order of the Spire. Gradually, Valkorion began to conquer wild space, but still didn't confront the Republic, as his eternal empire began to take shape. Meanwhile, in his body as the Sith Emperor, he spent decades infiltrating the institutions of the known galaxy, including the Jedi Order. Later, he vanquished the spirit of Naga Sadow from Yavin 4 and took the planet for his own, establishing the Imperial Guard Academy. Then, perhaps unexpectedly, he took an apprentice, Exel Kresh. Hey, if Anakin Skywalker can have one, then anybody can. If Kresh's name rings a bell, that's because she was a hybrid human-Sith descendant of Ludo Kresh, Naga Sadow's nemesis. In the Old Republic Blood of the Empire webcomic series, he experiments on her and prepares to make her a vessel for his mind. He maintained Valkorion as his dominant voice in the unknown regions and wild space, but he also had various bodies that served his needs on Dromund Kaas in the old Sith Empire. Finally, in 3681 BBY, Valkorion decided to use the Sith Empire to launch an assault on the Republic. The Sith Empire attacked multiple planets throughout the Outer Rim, catching the Republic off guard. The Journal of Master Nyastaral reveals how Sith forces massacred everybody who refused to join their empire and killed all Republic forces, even if they surrendered. They reclaimed Korriban, where the Emperor developed his ultimate slaves, his so-called children. These were powerful young Force users who would be unaware of their allegiance until he channeled his energy through them. Notably, Kira Carson, one of the children, discovered the truth when she was 10 and fled Dromund Kaas. It was soon after this that the Emperor's apprentice, Kresh, discovered that he planned to hollow out her mind and make her the first of his children. She fled after the massacre of Ortolan, but the assassin Kel tracked her down and killed her in the Sith Academy on Korriban. The Emperor, in his Sith body, furiously wiped out all mention of the Kresh name, leaving no trace of their existence. War raged across the galaxy for decades, with victories on both sides. The Empire took Utapau and Agamar, while the Republic won at Bothawui and Alderaan. A Jedi strike team also captured the Emperor's Dreadmasters, depriving him of their battle meditation abilities. However, around the time of a catastrophic Republic defeat at Bothawui, Valkorion experienced another major turning point in his life in the unknown regions. He had an affair with one of his elite guards, Senya Tiral, and they had two sons, Arkan and Thexan. We know from the Old Republic game that the boys adored him, but his body barely acknowledged their existence as he focused his mind on the events raging in the known galaxy. Meanwhile, Revan still had a part to play. If you remember from earlier, his spirit actually inhibited Vitiate from invading the galaxy, and now the fallen Jedi channeled his energy to convince him to sue for peace. The Sith Empire and the Republic were both exhausted after 3 decades of galactic carnage. The Old Republic comic book series reveals how the Sith stripped entire worlds of their resources to strip the war effort. Then Valkorion and Tiral had their third child, a daughter named Vaylin. However, Vaylin inherited her father's incredible power. Remember when Tenebrae was committing massacres before he was 10 years old? Valen was a chip off the old block because she made furniture move from inside the womb and tore droids apart as a toddler. Valkorion feared his daughter but was also pleased that she showed such potential. However, Tyral pleaded with him to help her, but this is where he lost his chance of winning Father of the Year. His solution was to give her the equivalent of a forced lobotomy, suppressing her powers and sociopathic nature, but also irrevocably damaging her personality. A disgusted and devastated Tyral left his side after this, never meeting him again as she returned to the Knights in an obscure area of the Infinite Empire. Supposedly, it was one of the few regrets of Valkorion's existence. In 3653 BBY, the Sith approached the Republic with an offer of peace. While negotiations were taking place on Alderaan, a secret Sith fleet attacked Coruscant. They forced the Republic to sign the Treaty of Coruscant, which officially ended the Great Galactic War, although it wasn't quite this simple. It was essentially a glorified ceasefire, with both sides recuperating and rebuilding their forces after decades of devastation and loss. The Republic resentfully also ceded territory as part of the treaty, which they were determined to get back. This ignited a period of history known as the Cold War. At this point, we know from the Old Republic holonet that the Sith Emperor withdrew into seclusion, leaving the Dark Council to run the Empire's affairs. 10 years after the Treaty of Coruscant, an unnamed Jedi Knight killed the son of the Sith Lord Darth Angral, igniting another hot conflict. The Sith Lord used super weapons against the Republic, although he didn't have the full strength of the Empire behind him. This Jedi took the Emperor's former child, Kira Carson, as a Padawan. When the Sith Emperor learnt of her existence, he wanted to control her again, but ultimately failed. The Jedi defeated Angral at an abandoned mining facility and earned the moniker the Hero of Tython, while Carson fully severed a connection to the Emperor. This would be crucial for the events to come as we finally move toward our conclusion. Angral's campaign was just one of several proxy conflicts that broke out during this period. However, a galactic conflict exploded again after the spirit of Mitra Surik enlisted the Jedi Master Oteg and a Republic strike team to free Revan from the Maelstrom, against his will. The Old Republic game shows how the Emperor immediately set his plans in motion to absorb all life across the entire galaxy. The Sith Empire broke the Treaty of Coruscant, and war began in earnest again. Needless to say, most of the Sith Empire was entirely unaware of their Emperor's plans. Don't forget, he had purged his Dark Council, so the only living being who really knew his vision was Lord Scourge, the Emperor's Wrath. Scourge had betrayed Revan and Surik because he had a vision that it was another's destiny to defeat the Emperor. Finally, after centuries, he encountered the being in the vision, the Jedi known as the Hero of Tython. Scourge reported this to the Emperor, knowing that his boss would be very interested in the fact that the hero had joined a strike team that planned to capture him. This Jedi strike team entered his fortress and fought their way through Imperial Guard and Sith spawn. Finally, the hero, Kira Carson, and the Jedi Master Tol Braga entered the Emperor's throne room and confronted him. However, this didn't go well, with the Emperor doing his regular trick of mentally overwhelming his opponents and blasting them with Force lightning before sending them into unconsciousness. The three Jedi fell to the dark side after the Emperor psychologically and became his agents. Eventually, the hero managed to escape with the aid of the spirit of Orgus Den and our old friend, Lord Scourge. They fled to Tython, where Scourge and the hero alerted the Jedi Council to the Emperor's horrific scheme to annihilate the galaxy. This triggered one of the most defining races in galactic history. The Emperor was desperate to start his ritual and made multiple attempts, but the hero intervened and stopped his efforts. One of the Emperor's most horrifying strategies was to use his pawn, the now Dark Jedi Master Braga, to massacre civilians on Corellia to trigger the ritual. Fortunately, a Jedi Force intervened and foiled this plan. The hero would eventually draw Braga back to the light on an Imperial battlecruiser above Coronet City. Then the Emperor suffered a major blow when he lost his first son, lifting the shroud that protected the rest of his children. The Jedi could now track down his network of spies and agents. Next, the hero learnt of the Emperor's location on Dromund Kaas, where he traveled for their final confrontation. After fighting their way through the Imperial defenses, the hero and his droid, T-701, confronted the Emperor in the Dark Temple and fought an epic duel. The hero defeated the Emperor's phantoms and gradually gained the upper hand before finally delivering a devastating strike to end the fight. He believed the Emperor was dead, but as we know, this was not the case. The hero had only destroyed his shell, known as the Emperor's Voice. Severely weakened, his essence returned to another body, the Emperor's hand, on Yavin 4, where he recuperated. There were some unintended consequences, including the loss of control of his children, as well as the lifting of the mental barriers around his biological daughter, Vaylin. However, she didn't strike back against him, instead opting to bide her time. At this point, Revan learnt that the Emperor had survived the clash with the hero and founded a new order to finish him off once and for all. Revan planned to revive the Emperor because he believed he could defeat him in a duel. However, this took him into conflict with both the Republic and the Sith, who believed it was too risky and could result in the destruction of everything. They formed an unlikely alliance and defeated his radical forces on Yavin 4. The alliance came about in the knowledge that Vitiate was still trying to perform his life-consuming ritual, and that nothing would exist if he succeeded. They defeated Revan and his cult, but the chaos on Yavin 4 fueled the Emperor's spirit, and his essence vanished from the moon. He resurfaced on Zeost, where he began possessing the planet's population, causing death and disasters. Again, an allied Republic and Sith force confronted Vitiate and his puppets. However, we know from the Old Republic game that he performed another vile ritual, unleashing dark side energy across the planet and turning all living things to ash. He absorbed the Force from Zeost and regained his former strength, but now he decided it was time to leave the Sith Empire behind for good, and he channeled his full energy into Valkorion, Emperor of the Eternal Empire. Valkorion decided that the time was right to focus his entire energy on the Infinite Empire. His ideology also shifted from consuming all life in the galaxy to reshaping it in his image. Shortly after the Battle of Zeost, Valkorion's sons eagerly approached him because they wanted to take the Eternal Fleet and test the strength of the worlds between the Eternal Empire and the Outer Rim. The Eternal Fleet had been sitting idle for decades, waiting for Valkorion to unleash it. Valkorion agreed on the condition that Thexan lead the attack while Arcan stayed at home on Zakuul. However, Arcan ignored him and accompanied his twin brother. He suffered severe wounds during an assault on Korriban, losing an arm and half his face. However, Valkorion, being the kind and loving father, thought it was his own fault for disobeying him. Finally, Arcan and Thexan returned to their father and presented him with trophies from their victories, but he turned away in disinterest. An enraged Arcan confronted Valkorion and intended to kill him, but Thexan intervened and tried to stop his brother. Thexan paid the ultimate price for his action because Arcan cut him down. Again, this didn't bother Valkorion at all, although it horrified Arcan, who faced no consequences for slaying his twin. The Republic and the Empire continued their uneasy collaboration because they knew that the spirit of the Sith Emperor was somewhere out there. After the Eternal Fleet withdrew, they sent a combined fleet into the unknown regions in pursuit of the attackers. The Sith Lord Darth Mar led the strike force because he was one of the Empire's greatest battlefield commanders. Book of Sith, Secrets from the Dark Side reveals that despite being on the Dark Council, he was uninterested in petty squabbles and infighting. He drove back entire Republic fleets during the Great Galactic War, defending Korriban and Zeost. The leading Republic officer on this expedition was a figure known as the Alliance Commander, or the Outlander. The Outlander and the Hero of Tython can be the same person in the Old Republic game, depending on how you play it. For clarity, I'll just refer to this key figure as the Outlander moving forward. Suddenly, the Eternal Fleet appeared and attacked them as they passed through wild space. The strike force suffered devastating losses, and Prince Arcan captured Darth Mar and the Outlander, holding them on his flagship before bringing them to his father on Zakuul. Mar immediately understood after meeting Valkorion that he was just another face of the former Sith Emperor. In the Old Republic game, Valkorion offered Mar and the Outlander the opportunity to join him, but they rejected him outright. Mar killed several of the Emperor's guards before taking a fatal blast of lightning in the chest. Valkorion then repeated this offer to the Outlander, but in a shocking moment, Arcan struck his father down, assassinating him. However, Valkorion is as difficult to kill as a cockroach, and he shifted his essence into the Outlander's mind, inhabiting his mind but not possessing his body. Arcan knew he hadn't properly killed his father, so his solution was to freeze the Outlander in carbonite to contain him. Then he seized his father's throne and proclaimed himself the Eternal Emperor. The Outlander remained a prisoner for 5 years until the Sith Lord Lana Beniko rescued him. Throughout this period, Valkorion conversed with his host's mind and tried to convince him to aid him in taking the galaxy for their own. It's worth noting that he seemed genuinely concerned that his son Arcan was going to destroy the empire that he created. Beniko, the Outlander, and their companions eventually uncover the Gravestone, the one ship that could overwhelm the Eternal Fleet in head-to-head combat. Later, an encounter with the Scions of Zakuul alerted them to Valkorion's presence within the Outlander. They fled Zakuul after a confrontation with Arcann and established a presence on the remote world of Odessen. The Outlander then established another alliance between the Republic and the Empire to take on the Eternal Empire once and for all. Arcann learnt of their plans and sent a massive force to Odessen, but suffered a catastrophic defeat, with the Outlander finally defeating him in one-on-one combat. This left Vaylin, the daughter of Valkorion, as the new Empress of the Eternal Empire. Valkorion had become frustrated with his host and even appeared to leave him at one point because he refused to open himself to other aspects of the Force beyond the light. But this battle confirmed that his presence remained within the Outlander. Now we're moving toward the final chapter in this long and epic story. Valkorion desperately wanted to reclaim his throne from his wayward daughter and manipulated the Outlander toward this goal. The Republic hero went all the way to the planet where this story began, Nathema. While on the desolate world, he entered the vaults under the Sanitarium, although Valkorion desperately tried to warn him away. The Outlander discovered a holocron holding the Force essence of Lord Dromund, Valkorion's father, from almost 2 millennia ago. Dromund offered the Outlander the holocron as a method of defeating Valkorion forever. He returned to Odessen, where Vaylin and the Eternal Fleet launched another huge assault, but the Outlander defeated her. Shockingly, this left the Eternal Fleet without a master, so they defaulted to their factory settings of mass extermination. This ironically forced the Outlander to claim the Eternal Throne so that he could stop them from committing mass genocide. Without realizing it, he played right into Valkorion's hands. Valkorion shattered the mind of his host, forcing him back into the depth of his psyche. What occurred next was an internal mental duel of spirits with the Outlander wearing the body of Valkorion. He used Dromund's holocron to break Valkorion's hold over the spirits of his children, and they united with the Outlander against their father. Finally, when all seemed lost, the Outlander uttered the words that triggered Vaylin: "Kneel before the dragon of Zakuul." Shockingly, this rendered Valkorion powerless, and he faced the spirits of his entire family, including Senya, the mother of his children. She struck him with her lightsaber, but he tried to lash out against the Outlander one final time. The Alliance commander then struck him down, finally ending Valkorion, the Eternal Emperor. But there was another late twist in this tale. Back in his days as Vitiate, he locked his original Tenebrae body in stasis, where nothing could affect it in any way. Only his most trusted servants knew that it existed, including our old friend Lord Scourge. Meanwhile, the former Emperor had carved an ancient Sith ritual into that original body as a last resort in case it was harmed. It would unleash a plague against the attackers, although it wouldn't affect anybody who had previously been granted a portion of Vitiate's power. Lord Scourge and Kira Carson located and destroyed this body at almost the same time as the commander struck down Valkorion. It instantly rendered them comatose, although they were immune to the plague. Jedi Grandmaster Satele Shan and her allies rescued them, but became infected in the process and became trapped in a hive mind. Carson and Scourge left the doomed Jedi on a transport ship with med droids before seeking the help of the Outlander. You'd think destroying his original body would have been enough to destroy Vitiate, but his scattered consciousness still existed within the Force. His core identity, Tenebrae, still lingered, and he attempted to fully restore himself by stabilizing his original self. He planned to use his possessed and infected victims to revive himself one final time. This was his last contingency against permanent destruction. The Outlander returned to Odessen, where he and his companions faced Vitiate's fanatical servants on the ship that carried Satele Shan. After fighting their way through the chaos, with the assistance of Revan's spirit, they entered Shan's mindscape. In the final showdown, the former Emperor's 3 main personas confronted the Outlander and attempted to overwhelm him. Of course, I'm talking about Tenebrae, the Sith Emperor Vitiate, and the Eternal Emperor Valkorion. They mocked him and attempted to dominate him, but the spirit of Darth Mar and the consciousness of Master Shan came to his aid. Together, they combined their power to finally defeat the Emperor for all time, as he crumbled to dust. That was the irrevocable end of Vitiate, arguably one of the 2 most powerful Sith in galactic history. Darth Sidious is probably his main competitor for this illustrious title, and in the Darth Plagueis novel, he muses how Vitiate came closer than any other Sith to immortality. Meanwhile, if you're hoping there's some chance of him returning, it's unlikely. He doesn't exist at all yet in the new canon. Also, the Darth Bane novel confirmed that he was destroyed in this final encounter. Nonetheless, Darth Maul will confirm that nobody is ever 100% dead in Star Wars, so who knows where this story could go next. There's no doubt that this is one of the most catastrophically epic reigns in Star Wars. Vitiate, in his various guises, was responsible for the deaths of literal trillions of people across multiple major galactic conflicts. Remember, this was the guy who was so evil that he convinced the Jedi and the Sith to work together. Let me leave you with that final thought.
Oh, and again, for a limited time, every Stickman saber purchase comes with 2 additional combat sabers, so you're more than ready for your own duels. If that sounds like something you'd want to look into, the link's in the description.